Who will the Montreal Canadiens pick at number 1 this year? Our Puck Dudes prediction is coming up. Alright, so welcome back to Puck Dudes. I know we are in the middle of this year's playoffs, but we've got the NHL entry draft coming up on July 7th. The Montreal Canadiens won the draft lottery, and they have that coveted first overall pick in this year's draft. We know Shane Wright is widely regarded as being the most likely to be picked first, but the question is just how likely is that to be the case? So here with his take on that first choice selection, we have Puck Dude Paul Johnson. Paul, what do you see in terms of who's most likely to be picked first?
Shane Wright will be the number 1 pick for the Montreal Canadiens at this year's entry draft. He's a consensus number 1. Has been for quite some time. If you go on and do any searches on Shane Wright and any scouting reports anywhere across the internet, particularly you go to Elite Prospects, for instance, you'll find 13 different scouting reports, all have him rated as the consensus number 1 pick. And he has been the dominant player all year long and will continue to be so. Now, Jeff Gorton and Kent Hughes, being American, people will say maybe he'll go to somebody like Logan Cooley, or Kent Hughes will go to somebody like Logan Cooley because he has the connection to the American program. But Kent Hughes is not a dumb man. And the fiasco of taking Jesperi Kotkaniemi and going off the board at 3 a couple years ago did not work out very well. And things will not turn out well in La Belle Province if Shane Wright does not go at number 1. Secondly, he's a great talent, and he has done everything right all along the way. He's a 200-foot player. I will admit, I've watched him several times, and he does not wow you. He is not a wow player, but he plays 200 feet. He skates reasonably well. He does things very, very quickly. Scouts will critique his shot and his overall skating. He has a great first stride, but then sometimes can take a little bit off as he moves into the play. But he's all over the place. He's smart, and he's a dominant player. The second part of that is that he is a centerman. Now, he's not really good at faceoffs. In fact, the nights I've seen him play, he was actually horrendous in the faceoff dot. But that can be learned, and he will get better with that as he develops his NHL game. And NHL centers are like currency, that big first-line center that will dominate a game and take the key face-offs and play those big minutes and be good defensively as well as offensively. They're like gold and currency in the NHL. Now, Logan Cooley, who apparently has more flash to his game, is also a centerman. But, all along, Cooley's getting better, but Shane Wright has remained dominant and has stayed at the top. Third, his stats keep improving. He broke into the league after being a exceptional admit into the OHL in the midget draft and coming in a year early. He had 66 points in 58 games and was a dominant rookie. Then he had a year off with the pandemic, and he comes back and he gets 94 points. And the problem is he's been compared to Sidney Crosby. He's been compared to Connor McDavid. Now you've got Connor Bedard coming next year, who is a wow player and probably a generational player as well. So, he's got big shoes to fill and lots of pressure on him to do so. The fact that he has come back after a pandemic season that was missed, he dominated at the U18s, and then came back and had a decent season and a good playoff with the Kingston Frontenacs. He continues to develop. The critique on him is that he hasn't developed enough, but he's done everything right. He has done nothing wrong that it should have him drop below the number 1 draft. And I guess that leads to our fourth point. He's been the best of his cohort for many years. He was a dominant midget when he led the Don Mill Flyers. He then was a dominant rookie in the OHL. He then wins Rookie of the Year. He dominates at the U18, and he's still the best prospect in the eyes of almost every scout. This is a no-brainer. Shane Wright goes number 1 to the Montreal Canadiens.
All right, thanks for that, Paul. I agree, and I think it is most likely that Shane Wright will be picked first overall. I think the numbers back that up. Part of the reason for that, though, I think, is about risk management. It's not only about Shane Wright and the pluses that he brings, but I think it's also about, if you look at each of the other players who are considered leading contenders to be potentially picked, at least in the top 5, each one of them, other than Shane Wright, has a fairly significant drawback or risk in being selected. Logan Cooley and Matthew Savoie, for example, they're both on the smaller side overall. They're not tiny, but they're smaller certainly than somebody like Shane Wright. And we know when it comes to draft time, that's one of the things that managers are considering, is the fact that when you select a smaller player, there's always that question in the back of your mind: how well will they transition to play at the NHL level, the more physical level of play? Will they bulk up? Will they bring that size piece, or to compensate that with a physicality in their game that will allow them to be successful at the NHL level, just as they have presumably been successful at the junior level? With Cutter Gauthier, you have a different problem. There you've got the old apples versus oranges comparison question. Coming from the US National Development Team program, his 1.20 points per game looks good, it looks solid, but how do you compare that to Shane Wright's 1.49 points per game? When you don't have a direct comparison, the safer pick for a team is to go with the guy that has the numbers on paper. That, in this case, would be Shane Wright. And then you've got Conor Geekie. He's another player who's in the top 5, or considered to be a potential contender in the top 5 selection positions, and a possible consideration for number 1 pick overall. And the numbers, I think, are really promising for Geekie, coming from the Winnipeg Ice of the Western Hockey League. But again, I think he's just going to be seen as being less proven in comparison to Shane Wright. Shane Wright has been successful at the World Juniors level. He's had success both in the regular season, the OHL, and in the playoffs. And Wright has also had that much more production going back several years at various levels than what Geekie has had. Not to say that Geekie's numbers have been bad, not at all. He's certainly going to be picked fairly high, but I just think he's a little bit more of a risk than what the Canadiens will be wanting to take on, compared to Shane Wright, who really is a very safe pick for number 1. So I think the stats do support the Habs picking Shane Wright at that number 1 overall selection. Make no mistake, nobody expects this to be a Connor McDavid level of selection, or even a Connor Bedard level of selection, but Shane Wright is a good, safe pick for number 1, and that's what the Montreal Canadiens most likely will be doing on July 7th.